And that to me is why story becomes really important when we start to want to understand, why it's so hard to say ouch. And I think the cultural story for men, you're up against a lot more than women are with the permission to feel emotions, to express pain.
Welcome to 3%. We're your hosts, Jamie Haig.
And I'm Blake Roberts.
We're two best friends, fathers, husbands, and just two guys trying to figure it out.
We're also therapists, which is probably a pretty important part.
That's true.
And we believe that at our best, people are 97% honest with themselves and others. And it's that hidden 3% of emotions, needs, desires, and behaviors that we keep to ourselves that keep us bound to shame and loneliness, from which many of our issues stem.
Each week on this podcast, we'll interview leaders in the fields of psychology, theology, arts, and athletics to explore holistic masculinity. We're not here to tell you the man you need to be, but we are here to help you explore what gets in the way of being the man you want to be.
We're going to help you develop courage and give you the tools to share your 3% in the relationships that matter most, so you can more deeply connect with yourself, God, and others. So, pull up a chair.
Let's get into it.
So let's be honest. Let's be honest. Let's be honest.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the 3% podcast. We have a really special guest on today. You've heard Jamie and I talk about this place out in Seattle before a number of times. You've heard us talk about the last name Allender a number of times. And if you've been around, I think our second or third episode, we had Dan Allender on the show. Still one of our most popular episodes, not surprisingly. Today we have the gift of talking with the person who I would say reigns in Dan's craziness. We have the co-host of the Allender Center podcast, Rachel Clinton Chen. And she has been, at least for me, I found out about the Allender Center really early in my 12-step recovery journey and started binging the podcast really early. And so her voice and Dan's voice have been a really instrumental part in my healing journey, and I know many others. So it's a really fun, kind of crazy full circle moment to get to talk to Rachel today. Rachel is a trauma care practitioner, preacher, pastor. She's a lead instructor at the Allender Center at the Seattle School. And like I said, she also co-hosts the very popular podcast, the Allender Center podcast. She holds a degree in religion and divinity and was recently named one of Sojourners, which is a magazine. This is amazing. One of the 9 Christian women shaping the church in 2024, which is, we could talk a lot about that,
cool.
I'm sure. So cool.
It was very humbling. Yeah.
I bet. Her work focuses a lot on addressing the harm and abuse, particularly spiritual abuse, at the intersection of trauma, embodiment, and spiritual formation. She also leads the story workshop for spiritual abuse and healing. And we're also chatting before the show. She's a diehard sports fan and a Philly sports fan, we found out, which is just fun. We could probably have a whole episode just talking about sports and trauma recovery from being a fan of certain teams.
Right.
Word.
So today we're going to talk a lot about story work, which we'll explain what that is. We're going to talk about trauma, what actually is trauma, and what does recovering from trauma look like. And we have somebody who has I think what I really appreciate about Rachel is not just her knowledge of trauma work and recovery from trauma. And I don't even know Rachel other than hearing her on the podcast, but her embodied experience of recovering from her own story, which is what I think makes her so profound. And so we're excited. Thank you, Rachel, for being on the show.
Yeah, I think it's such an honor to be here with you guys.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting experience of I think like Blake was saying, it feels like we have this previous friendship with you because of how much we've listened to the podcast. And so to get to talk to you, you don't know us at all. So get to talk to you is a really
full circle moment for both of us. And thankfully, you have an incredibly warm presence. So it feels a little bit like we already do have that friendship, which is great. We're glad you're here.
Well, it's always a gift to get to meet people that in some ways, because this is the thing I actually hate about podcasting. I think it's so powerful that we get to have conversations that we get to share, right? And I always have people in mind, but I'm such a like on the ground, like I want to be on the ground face to face. And
Yeah.
like just having coffee and having this conversation. So it's always such a joy to meet people that in some ways you are in conversation with and to
Yeah.
actually get to hear their part of the conversation. So
Yeah.
it's a true gift to me. So thank you.
Yeah, there's so many times when I'll be hearing you and Dan talk where I'm like, I want to ask a question to what was just said. Like, I have a thought about something you just said and I want to ask a question, you know, but it's like this one-way conversation, which is
Yeah.
very interesting, but you guys do it really well. I'm curious, before we like get into what we're going to talk about, if you gave us and the listeners kind of a 30,000, especially for the listeners who don't know you, who haven't maybe listened to any of the Allender Center podcasts, if you gave us a 30,000 foot view of Rachel and what has brought Rachel to doing the work that she does today, and some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, like why are you where you are doing what you do?
It's a great question. It's funny because I have to keep adding more years to it. I used to be like, if you had asked me 15 years ago, and now I'm like, if you had asked me 25 years ago, which is its own kind of like, oh my God. Yeah, I mean, I had a call to ministry from a very young age. So I had always found myself drawn to helping people, to healing, to like, you know, I want people to understand like the goodness of God, experience God. I was raised Southern Baptist. Like was pretty faithful. I mean, I have a lot of trauma in there, but pretty faithful to just keep saying yes to things like study biblical studies. Like what? At a Southern Baptist university? Like, what am I going to do with this? Who knows? But okay, I'll do it, you know? And so I actually had, studying what I studied, I had this frame of like sociology and theology and biblical studies and history and just all these things. I was working with teenagers at a youth group and realizing that all this really great, beautiful knowledge I had about the story of God was not necessarily translating to the healing and kind of hope and transformation that the young people I was working with, I knew were desperate for. And so I started kind of thinking like, I think I need more education, which I had already been like, I'm not going to more theological education because if you've ever studied theologically, it's just kind of existential and, it's a lot. And so, but I found this grad school like out in the Pacific Northwest that like the way they described themselves on their website was just like so relational. Like we take people's stories really seriously. And honestly, I went to school like, I want to help people. So I'm going to go get these skills and these tools. And like very quickly into my time, it was kind of like an attempt to help someone in this kind of practicum type classroom. And it just failed miserably. And I was such a like recovering codependent I was very codependent at that time. I didn't know I was recovering, and I'll just keep going. And so, like the entrance for me into story work and understanding trauma was actually like, I want to help people, but very quickly, like, oh, I have a story I have some trauma. And I just was very fortunate to be at a place that said, good, that needs to be a part of your learning. You need to integrate that into, in an MDiv program, like into your studies, your character formation, your healing is really important. So psychology for me just felt like kind of the missing puzzle piece that like once it came, it was like all of a sudden the gears started moving like pretty rapidly. And, understanding, I mean, I'd already had this frame of hermeneutics and like how we read and make meaning, but to like throw psychology in there was just like, whoa, okay. There's a lot. And I think also I was just aware for myself, I would not have said at the time trauma manifesting. I just was very aware. I would have said like these character flaws, or like, I'm kind of crazy sometimes. I'm really anxious.
Yeah.
I'm, yeah, just noticing these places of like, now I would say like breaks of integrity.
Yeah.
But at the time I would have just been like, I'm kind of crazy.
You
But
said
I don't know
breaks of
why.
integrity. Is that what you said?
Yeah,
Oh,
like
cool.
thinking about like that kind of wholeness piece, right? Like I would be like, this doesn't fit, like this behavior doesn't fit how I perceive myself, but I actually don't have control over it. So
Yes.
yeah, so I think trauma and understanding trauma just gave me it was so healing and so transformative. I wish I could say like understanding my story and how I got to be who I was like instant transformation, but it didn't quite work out that way. But it was such a like I said, like the missing piece that brought so many things together. Like the way I would describe it is just like being planted in fertile soil that just lends itself to rapid like flourishing and growth. And yeah, it changed the way I understood the story of God, the way I understood spiritual formation. And the way I had a different kind of path or tools or resources to do work with other people kind of within that framework. So that's probably maybe a little more than a 30,000 foot view, but
No, that's a very helpful view.
yeah.
I think, we talked about where Blake and I want to take this is we've talked a lot on this podcast about people's stories. We've talked about such a wide variety of topics, from like cultural identity to male identity, spiritual identity.
Yeah.
But we haven't really distinctly talked about trauma. And I think what would be helpful, I think there's probably a lot of people listening who are in the same place that you were when you were saying, I'm just a little crazy sometimes.
Yeah.
You're like,
Yeah.
they may have no concept for
Yeah.
what is trauma, or maybe they're sick of hearing about
Right.
trauma as this
Right.
cultural idea,
Yeah.
but it may be actually very impactful to their story and growth if they have a more personal, relatable understanding of trauma. So
Yeah.
could you, from your perspective, give us
Sure.
an idea of what is trauma?
Totally. And it's kind of like trauma is definitely one of those words, like so many words right now, that's very familiar. But yeah, what are we actually talking about? And, I'm very fortunate to work with a lot of people who come out of abuse, right? And abuse and trauma are not necessarily the same thing. Because trauma, I think for me, the most simple definition, and I can like build it out, is actually, and honestly, it's either Peter Levine or it's Gabor Mate. And for life of me, I can't figure it out. And I got to find the book, but I think it's Gabor Mate quoting Peter Levine in like an intro. But just this sense that trauma is not actually what happens to us. It's what's kind of left behind in the absence of an empathetic witness. So when we think about trauma, it's the residue of the harm that gets like is not metabolized because either, if it's happening in a family of origin context, everyone's surviving, right? Like what we understand about trauma is likely if you're being abused or there's kind of violence or things playing out in your home, you're likely in the presence of people who have a lot of unmetabolized trauma that's just wreaking havoc on how they cope, how they survive. And, we can look at like the ACEs test, right? Like adverse childhood experiences is really talking about lots of different things that can lend itself to show up as trauma in the body. And ultimately trauma it takes up residence in the body, right? Like it's going to impact our nervous system, our, like how we breathe. It's certainly going to impact our psychology and how we make sense of the world, our hermeneutic. It is a spiritual wound, right? Like when you have experienced harm, that brings fragmentation, right? And fragmentation just meaning, I think in all the ways, holistically, right? Like it disrupts neurological pathways. Like people use the language of like things get frozen, processes get stunted. I used to joke, if we got into like the brain science of trauma, like I have a small but mighty hippocampus because so much of my story was just being terrified a lot. And so, the kind of origin story. So Rachel was just a really fearful child. And I would have said 25 years ago, I'm just really anxious and fearful. Like, this is just who I am. And that was why part of that invitation for someone to say, hey, who you are didn't get formed in a vacuum. And there's some stories that actually hold the data for how you came to be and how you came to manage your world in the way that you did. You're not just anxious, you've actually survived a lot of terror. That is a very slight kind of shift of making meaning of my story and my world. Again, like, kiddos are incredible, they're great at observation, but nobody has the luxury of being good at interpretation when you need to hold on to your primary attachments, no matter how troubled or broken they are. Those are your people. And so, trauma is that, like, the way the harm we've experienced when we don't have people helping us make sense of it. So if, let's say, you were someone who did experience abuse, maybe by someone, a teacher, but you had parents who realized what was happening, intervened to stop the harm, put you in therapy, or helped you talk with someone to make sense about what happened to you, that experience of harm may not turn into lifelong trauma that you have to deal with, because as the harm is being metabolized, it's being healed, it's being mended. And so, I think when we talk about, like, the story element of trauma, it's just one frame of making sense of how we've come to be. And for me, I had to start doing work around, I'm not just wired to be anxious because it's my personality. My body has had to survive by being incredibly hypervigilant, by flooding cortisol to, like, stay aware and be alert and get out of situations. And that, like, tending to that was very holistic, right? Like, I did need to do some therapy to understand, like, okay, I'm not crazy. Like, yes, this was my normal. And yes, I have a lot of mercy and compassion and understanding of the people I love and how they came to be who they are. But that's not necessarily helping me heal and tend to pain, not just emotional pain, but actual, like, physical ways in which this trauma is manifesting. And also how I think church contexts can be really hard, because we're so theologically trained to see, like, bad behavior as, like, just this kind of moral category of sin. But when you start to understand trauma and the way trauma manifests, addictive processes are often a way the body is trying to bring soothing where there's unaddressed wounds, right? That are just either too threatening, too pervasive, too overwhelming. And there hasn't been resources built to get that soothing in more healthy ways. So I could go on and on and on. And I don't think, it's hard because people would say, well, so it's just everyone traumatized. And I'm like, well, probably everyone bears, like, some aspect of their nervous system not functioning the way it was, like, most created and intended to. And I think Chuck DeGroat said this, he might have been quoting someone, but he was just talking about, like, our nervous systems aren't, like, plugging into everybody else's nervous system to compare. Like, well, I don't feel like I can talk about this pain because, like, look at this other person and what they've survived. Like, their trauma is way worse. Like, your nervous system is just comparing to what you were meant for. And I think that's a really kind of humble, gracious invitation to just get to be curious about our bodies, our nervous systems, our style of relating and how we mitigate harm and how we like relate to other people, and how we've made sense of who God is, to try to understand our pain.
Yeah, even I think that's so helpful. Thank you for that overview. That part that you were talking about with Chuck DeGroat, I'm rereading his book, Healing What's Within, right now.
Yeah.
And I think something that I have been thinking about how impactful it is, probably for all people, but in my context, I'm thinking specifically for men, is the difficulty with saying ouch. That's how Chuck talks about it in his book. And it gets into this, like, I'm comparing my nervous system to the nervous system of somebody else because I have to dismiss what mine is feeling because I might not feel safe saying ouch.
Yeah.
And as you were talking, I was thinking about that for our listeners of, like, where do you notice that you have a hard time saying ouch because maybe that's pointing to some of, like, what's trauma for you won't be trauma for everybody. And so where do you have a hard time saying ouch might even point to some of the places that you need to give yourself the compassion to be curious about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like the ways in which we cope with trauma are actually like really brilliant and beautiful, right? Like, thank God that we have kind of a built-in resiliency that, well, you know, like an example I'd love to give is like, if you've known a lot of harm and a lot of neglect, a lot of deprivation, you might be really good at powering through in the midst of deprivation. And it's like, that's like, we can celebrate that young parts of you have become very just resilient and powering through. What happens is we start to reach these points into adulthood where that's not working. Your body gets older. It doesn't have as much capacity. Your relationships start to feel the strain of like how that plays out relationally. And it's those moments too that I think we get to go, like, this worked for a long time. It's not working anymore. Is there something more for me? And, you know, it's like, I love to use this example of like, let's say you lost a pet when you were little. Well, for one person, losing a pet, maybe they weren't that attached to it. Maybe it was a family pet. Maybe it just died of natural causes. And that was like a really sad story, but it wasn't traumatic. Maybe for another person, that pet was like everything. Like, there was not a lot of relational connection. There wasn't a lot of care. Maybe it died in a really violent way that felt like this is like mirroring abuse. And something that might seem insignificant is actually like a pretty profound picture of the harm they were experiencing. And that, to me, is why story becomes really important when we start to want to understand, why it's so hard to say ouch. And I think the cultural story for men, you're up against a lot more than women are with the permission to feel emotions, to express pain. You know, it's not awesome being like perceived as like just the emotional crazy ones, but it makes it a little easier to be emotional and kind of out there when it's like, well, that's what we expect from you. Right. And so I just have a lot of compassion for, I just think the generational wounds for men and not getting to see, you know, it's like I look at my dad and his generation and the stories he tells, and I'm just like, these are such profound trauma stories. But like the way you were told you need to deal with this was like, well, are you going to sit there and cry about it?
Right.
Are you going to get up? And it's like, when you're up against that kind of hostility to saying ouch, that's different healing work, you know, than if you're getting scooped up because you're being perceived as maybe a little more fragile, a little more tender. Yeah.
Which has its own massive healing that has to happen. Blake, you're having quite a reaction over there, man.
I didn't know if you guys could tell or not, or if my internet issues have made me blurry, but yeah, it was a weird experience. I think Rachel is the first guest that I have cried with. I don't know if you made me cry or just noting that you're the first one that I've done that with. When you were talking about trauma, and then you were talking kind of about it in the church context, I'm going to really hope that my internet doesn't get choppy here. I was thinking about a question I wanted to ask you, which was sort of like this broad? Why do you think we in the church have such a hard time talking about trauma, or maybe like glossing over trauma, and there's this real distinction? And I was thinking about a conversation I think recently with a client about like their personal experience, and I was just thinking about a lot of different things, and what is trauma, what isn't trauma, and for some reason I started thinking about how there's this inherent, I think I'm not the MDiv, so I'm gonna be careful here, but there's this like inherent trauma that we all hold as a result of the fall, like being in this broken world. Like there's this inherent trauma that we all connect with, and then because of our stories and all the things that you're talking about, our stories of harm that we individually experience, I guess I'm saying we have this like collective trauma in a sense, and then we have our own individual experiences of trauma. And at least in my experience in church growing up, there was a large emphasis on the collective trauma and the recognition of that, and the acceptance of Jesus and his rescuing us from that, and then like taking that message to other people. There was a complete miss for me in the exploration of my individual story. Or maybe there was a recognition of it, but there was not a encouraged exploration of it. That's why I think like the story work stuff that you guys talk about has been so impactful. Okay, so the tears that like literally just came out of nowhere, I feel like I can say it was like from God in that moment, which because of my spiritual story, which we won't get a ton into, I'm always like, I'm even hesitant of saying that because of things that were said to me in the name of like, God told me this. But I just had this moment of this feeling that God cares so much, just as much about my and you and Jamie and the listener, their individual experience of trauma, as much as he does this whole collective trauma that we can really easily rally around as believers and then like do the work from that.
Right.
But there was just such a miss in my experience of my individual story, and it was almost framed as this like selfishness.
Yep.
And so I think the tears were like a sort of gratitude for the depth of which God cares about all of our individual stories of harm, as much as he does this collective story of harm. Yeah, I don't know. That's what was happening, Jamie.
Yeah.
Well, and absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of the great devastations of our modern time, right? That the story gets so flattened, and I get it in some ways because we can't possibly imagine caring about the universe and the wholeness and restoration and like shalom of like a whole universe, while also like caring about every particle of that universe. Like we're just trying to like take care of ourselves and like the people we like really have to take care of, and then like maybe those we're called to serve, and that feels completely overwhelming. So I think we project a lot onto God. I also think the story of salvation gets flattened when like there's just so much there's something that interrupts this collective story of brokenness to make a way back, and we get to be like co-creators of that ongoing work of like pulling heaven to earth. And the amount of times like we see in the text, like God is a comforter. Like, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Like, we don't hear that a lot. Like, we don't hear like you get to be comforted. Like there gets to be a comforting intimacy for you that, yes, sometimes that grace is severe, right? Like when we're having to contend with how our brokenness is harming other people.
Right.
And I do think it's partly why the church doesn't want to look at the church doesn't want to look at like the ways it's perpetrated harm. So then you don't want to like actually get healing for the harm you've experienced, because it automatically makes you like, I want to make right any place that I have caused this kind of pain to someone else,
Yes.
wittingly or unwittingly.
Yeah.
And so it is a tragedy to me, because I can so relate. And I think part of my healing journey started with someone asking me like, do you believe God loves you as much or maybe even more than God loves God's mission for you? And I was like,
Excuse me.
Wait, say that one more time. Holy cow.
Like, do you? And I was like, because I mean, this is like, very early codependent Rachel, starting to question if I could maybe be loved if I wasn't helpful, And so it was like, I was already like, this is a lot, like, I don't know if I could take this this question. And I had literally, it was so, do you believe God loves you just as much, if not more, than God's mission for you? It really was this question of like, do you believe you're beloved? Like, even if you couldn't do another thing for God. And I was like, no.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm honest, no one's even asked me that. Like, somewhere in there's a memory that this could be a possibility.
Yeah.
Like a Sunday school teacher who might have said something like, it's about you being wrapped into God's heart, not God coming into your heart. Or maybe it's a little bit of both, like somewhere in there was like residue of like, this is possible. But it was so paradigm shifting. And I wish, like, and maybe like a North Star to like say, is that a possibility? So like I could experience that.
So what if I asked you that question right now today? What would you say?
Oh, I think, yes, like deep, like deep calls out to deep. Like, absolutely, I believe that's true. And that's true even with growing knowledge that like I bear a lot of privilege and have like benefited from systems. Like it's true in the face of even like, again, that severe grace of like, yeah, there's some truths I need you to face, oh daughter of mine. Like if you want to keep growing in that identity of being beloved, like if you want that integrity of like, you are beloved and so is every other part of my creation. But absolutely, I believe it's true that if, let's say, I had debilitating depression tomorrow, that like I couldn't get out of bed, like my identity as being beloved would be no less than it is in like my high functioning places. And do I always believe that? Do I always move from that place? No.
Yeah.
No.
So what do you do on the days when you don't believe it?
Oh gosh, I pick fights with my husband. Like try to like, be like, shame me. Yeah. I'd feel safer in shame, right? Like again, it's like that going back to places that actually feel way more familiar, like more safe, more tragic.
So treat me in the way that I am making up my identity to be so that I can feel safe in it being true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I have a moment of, example I always give is like, I clogged the toilet with my flushable wipes because I didn't know they weren't actually flushable, which I just feel like that's not really on me, but it is
right.
On me. And I just, it was like, he was being like so kind. And if I was coming from this place of like, Rachel, it's just you're human. It's a mistake. His kindness, I would have been able to be like, I can't believe I'm so lucky to be married to someone so kind. But I was just like, I know deep down in there you are. It was like I was just projecting on him all my shame. And then he was like, why are you needing me to fight you right now? And I was like, I don't know. It just feels like that would be more normal and better and what I'm used to. And then I can just be angry and shamed. It's just these patterns that are just still in there, right? And
I'll say for me, that gives me the opportunity then to earn back my value to you.
Totally.
If you'll shame me, then at least I can feel better that eventually I earned my way back into good standing with you. because that's
There's
how I
something I
earn
can
my
do.
value everywhere.
Yeah.
Wow.
I have more power. Like there's some way I can actually like maybe have some control over how things are going to go in this world. Yeah.
Oh, self-compassion's so hard.
It's really hard. Really hard.
Yes, it is and it isn't. Like that's I think the thing that is so like wild to me is like it is so hard. I'm not minimizing what you said, by the way, Jamie. It is so hard when there is a part of me that feels like it is responsible to carry the weight of giving myself compassion. Like, you know what I mean? Like I'm almost like trying to, I'm trying to force compassion on myself. And that is so hard because in a sense, it's not my job. But there is this thing within me that is, I mean, I would say like the spirit in me that is able to give me, that I can receive a compassion from that is so light and is not exhausting and not hard at all, because it's not something I have to force my way to. So it's like, yeah, it is and it isn't for me.
Yeah, it's almost like I think we interviewed a guy named Caleb Campbell on here. He's former NFL player. Now he's he calls himself a guide. I was trying to remember the word he uses. Threshold guide.
Threshold guide, yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
And I think the way that is coming to mind that I agree with you, Blake, is like, it doesn't have to be hard, because self-compassion is like, it's already where we are if we'll accept where we are. But it's also hard because we have such a high expectation that we should be somewhere else and not be okay with where we are. And I think that gets back to the trauma stories. I think that's where, you know, when Dan came on, I might butcher this quote of his, Blake, help me remember it correctly.
Okay.
But I think he said, what's the most ordinary is the most satanic. Is that what he said?
Subtle.
About
He said the more subtle, the more satanic. And we were like, okay, Dan, chill out.
In your story. Yeah, because it was like, you know, Blake and I both have parts of our story that are not subtle. Like, I have a story of abuse. Blake has a story of, you know, ruptured home life and attempted suicide. And like, we both have a story of addiction. None of that is very subtle.
Right.
But we also have all these parts of our story that are incredibly subtle, that get overshadowed by the not subtle parts. And actually, those are the places where I struggle the most to have self-compassion.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think grief is such a doorway. Anger too, like lament, true lament, right? Like that kind of marriage of grief and anger, like righteous anger. Because it's like, I think they are kind of like the doorways that allow us to get closer to the compassion, to the identity of beloved, when, you know, we're contending with places of just profound shame. Because I absolutely think certainly the more explicit places we feel shame, but we can like make the connection as to why we feel shame like pretty quickly, right? But the more subtle places where we feel so bound in shame, it feels like, no, this is 100% my shame to bear, you know, like, and I don't really know why, or, you know, so that's where I think story work can be a really powerful doorway to access grief and anger when we're in the, you know, someone else is witnessing with us a truth that maybe we couldn't hold in one season of life that we might have more capacity to hold now, about our story, about what's most true. And the ways in which that opens our hearts and our minds to a kind of just sorrow, and how that sorrow like actually helps us connect to the God of compassion who's been there the whole time, like ready to offer that comfort. But we, you know, it's kind of like with my husband, we've been like, no.
Yeah.
Like, cannot receive. I will, nope, fight me, shame me, punish
Yeah.
me.
Right.
That's all motivating,
Yeah.
It's a. Oh, go ahead, Jamie.
Well, I was going to say, do you think I'm noticing as I'm listening to you talk about that part that I think I get it, but I'm also like, I wonder if you could kind of help me with a more practical
Sure.
example so that
Yeah.
I can understand what you mean as like that grief connecting us to.
Yeah. This is where, like, in some ways, like, if we had more time, I would talk more about attachment. But
Sure.
just how, like, everyone's attached to their primary care providers, even if that attachment's really insecure. It's not like you either have an attachment or you don't. If someone like does a good job or a bad job, it's like, no, you're definitely wired for love. You're wired for attachment. And so I think about things like I've worked with folks where the way they initially tell a story leaves all the burden on them. Right. So, for example, for myself, maybe I'm going to tell a story about an interaction with one of my parents. And the way I started, I was just a really anxious little person, and everyone was just really busy. They were doing their best, and they just didn't really see me. And, I was just crazy, So one of my experiences often was like, I would have panic attacks if we got left in the car at the grocery store. Again, I don't actually think there was always like a insidious intention behind that. I actually do think there was a lot of exhaustion and like it's easier. But also like the beginning of the story, as I got into the story, is like my care provider knew I loved Stevie Wonder's song, I Just Called to Say I Love You. It came on the radio. They turned it up. So this is like one moment in the story where people are like, but you're saying they didn't see you that well, but like they know you love this song and they know your face is gonna light up. Like, don't you think they would have seen your face start to panic? And like if you saw like a little person's face start to panic, what would you do? It's like that's where like story work starts to help you go, how have I made meaning of this in a way that has tried to minimize harm, but I'm still left questioning, why was I so afraid? Why didn't anyone do anything to help me in my fear? And so the way young me metabolized that was like, I'm crazy. I'm difficult. None of my other siblings are having this reaction. Like nobody really sees me. I'm not being clear enough with these.
Yeah.
You're
and
not
so
doing
having
something.
to like, yes, right. And so having to like actually enter a story that had a lot of subtlety to go, no, there's other things at play here. And I may not fully understand why, but I can offer that little part of me that is like still in my nervous system, right? Like when we talk about like inner child, it's not just some like emotional, like little, it's like, no, there's like parts of my amygdala and my vagus nerve and my biochemicals that hold those memories that are also now fused with shame, like profound shame, that like I couldn't just pull it together or be more accommodating. I get to enter this story with people who go, but you were seen. So then someone's actively looking away or maybe wanting you to feel some of the terror they were feeling in their world. You're having a panic attack, which is like a real medical thing, and no one's helping you. You're feeling shame, your face is exhausted, and tears are streaming. So it's like someone getting in the story with me and helping me see what's happening by details I'm bringing. It's not like they're pulling out and I'm literally like, oh, and this song was playing. It was so great. And my mom turned it up and it was amazing. It's like, I think it's getting into those places of particularity to go, how did I come to think of myself as all of these things and not have the option, understandably so, to say something else was at play here that wasn't mine to bear. And it has deeply impacted me. And I still carry the debris of that in my sleep, in my gut, in my kind of hypersensitivity to danger and my shame when I feel afraid. So, and there's been so much healing, but it's come from like letting a really simple story that was familiar to me and also like a ritual, right? Like it's like one story, but it maybe played out several times. be held by others who are asking questions, not to just put all the blame on someone else, but to say, what is happening here? That might be different than the way you've made meaning of it, or might have some slight nuances that, like, little parts of you. Because when I first started telling that particular story, let's say at an Allender Center story workshop where we invite people to bring a story like that. And it's really hard for people because they're like, but if you don't know my whole life story, and it's like, let's just try it. Let's just try it. The first time I told that story, you would have thought I was just a crazy little 7-year-old, difficult, acting out. And over time, like, she's become more robust. She's become more human sized. She's become more a 7-year-old. She's become more delighted in the way that she's written in the story. And I have more, the adult me that's bringing this story from childhood, I have more ferocity on her behalf, more delight in her, more welcome of this part of me that is still very much like shaping my experience of the world. And that, I don't know if that makes sense. That might still feel really esoteric, but I think it's part of the work, right?
Yes.
And it feels so counterintuitive because it's like, well, who has time to like, tell a little 500-word narrative? But that doorway, it made connections to, like, lots of other stories, right? It gave me a different kind of compassion to see myself and to see the people in my midst in lots of different moments.
Yep.
Yeah.
I hear a sentiment like that often with the men that I work with when we're exploring early life childhood, and it is very much like I was just a really difficult kid, or I was just hard, or I was just
a troublemaker.
And it's like, yeah, sure, some of those things were true, and it's like, but often it's the case that belief of self is not really like the belief that they hold of themselves, but one that was projected because maybe their behaviors were difficult, and the person didn't know how to meet them in that, and so it got convoluted into I am difficult, and so the reason I got treated this way was my fault.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting, right? Because, like, for me in that story, like, the posture I had towards that story and that part of me was like, you are not welcome here. You are a sabotager. Like, you are the one who shows up and, like, makes me act crazy, and you're crazy, and I don't want you in my body or a part of my life. Like, you're bad.
Yeah.
And actually, she's like, that did not make that part of me get quieter. It was kind of like, well, I'm going to keep, like, you need to know things are not well, and the world is scary, and you're not listening to me, and you're not tending to me. And the shame is getting more intense. The fear is getting more intense. The agony is getting more intense. And so these opportunities to welcome back really exiled parts of us is part of what, like, those are the things that really stand in the way of being able to receive compassion and experience the comfort of God.
And that's part of that grieving you were talking about, of like grieving what those exiles didn't receive that they needed.
Yeah.
I think
and like grieving the ways I kind of joined in, in the narrative. Like, at one point I became the owner of that, it's like I became an adult. I moved and had a little more freedom, and I'm still the one like, you stay in this car, you ridiculous little, and having to grieve that, right? Like, well,
yeah, that kind of story is what maintains, again, Gabor Mate saying the question with addictions is not why the addiction, but why the pain. Right. It's like that kind of story. I'll speak just for me. I won't speak for all addicts, but for me, it's like I joined that narrative that I needed to disconnect from my shame of not being enough. Yeah. I needed to disconnect from my shame of or my fear, or like all these things of that were all based on this idea that I'm not worthwhile if I'm not perfect. And I joined that narrative, and that I agree with you. I think that's what maintained a lot of my addictive behavior.
I think it's hard to get to those points where we're like, how's that working for us?
Ugh.
Not really. It's not working great.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
there another way? And I
Yeah.
think that's what I would hope if someone's listening and they're resonating and feeling like all of their kind of attempts to just like punish themselves into goodness or good behavior, or, you know, like if that's not working, is there possibly another way?
And it seems more often the case that when it's not working, that can actually be a gift. Because as you were just saying, like with the part of you that you then joined in kind of excluding, like it's so resilient of our internal systems that those parts don't go away because they actually carry such goodness at the root, you know, and beneath like the problematic behavior that we think they're causing. So it's like, yeah, of course they don't go away because then our goodness would go away. And so it's like the parts of you that you are most frustrated with that don't seem to go away, maybe that's actually a good thing. And it can be. I read this, I know we're about to wrap up, but I read this quote, I don't even remember who it was from the other day, that said, we're terrified to let the heaviness be there because we think it will swallow us. But more often, it's the fighting and the avoiding that make us feel like we're disappearing. Turning toward the emotions we're trying to fight with kindness can lead to deeper connection with ourselves and ultimately with God. It's like kind of what you were, the summary of what you were saying with that part of you that historically you would join in fighting or pushing away, or it's like, no, the embrace of her, of that little girl in you is making you a more full and beautiful version of yourself today. And we all have those parts of us that, I mean, with the work that the three of us do, we sit with people every day with those parts of them that they want to try to exclude. And maybe that's not the path.
Well, and that's like the whole idea of our 3% brand is like at our best, we're 97% honest, and we start that with 97% honest with ourselves. And it's that 3% part that binds us to shame and loneliness because we're so afraid to even be honest with ourselves about these narratives that we're speaking over ourselves quite often.
Yeah. Rachel, this has been a joy. It makes sense that you were named 9 women that are changing the church in 2024.
Influencing the
church. I mean it. I really do mean it. Your labor and the work that you do has affected so many people. And you know, as I'm saying that, I'm thinking back to what you said earlier, the question of, do you believe that however you worded it, God loves you as much as he loves your mission for you? And as I'm realizing how many people your work and your story has affected, I mean, I think you could say that, like, the more you have embraced God's love for you, the mission that God has had for you has had an even greater impact. But it was like, because you kind of flipped the order in which those go a little bit, and so and I know it's not easy work. I know it's very. I mean, you're going upstream some pretty intense streams a lot of times. So thank you for
super inspiring.
Yeah. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for taking time to be with us today. I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this.
Well, the feeling is mutual, and just deep gratitude for you guys and the labor you're doing. And it's been such a delight, and just deeply encouraging for me as well to just be in conversation with you today. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for hanging out and listening. Jamie?
We're glad you're here. Keep coming back. You're worth it.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to another episode. Listen, we're working on some really practical resources to help you connect more deeply with yourself and others. So if you head over to our website, 3percentco.com, you can learn more about that. The link will be in the show notes. And this is the part of the show where we ask you for some help. Listen, we don't have a big fancy production team. We're recording these in my therapy office in between sessions and in the margins of our life. We just really believe in the message that much. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and rarely would I take the time to review and rate a show, just because honestly, I forgot. It wasn't until we started doing this show that I realized doing that actually really does help these platforms notice our show and get the word out. And so if any of this is impactful to you, we would love it if you took a second to leave us a review, rate us, or if you want to just do it the old-fashioned way, text this link to a friend and say, hey, let's talk about this episode. Whatever you do, make sure to follow us on whatever platform you're listening to so you never miss an episode. We're really grateful you're here, and we'll see you next week.
So let's be honest.